So hi everyone, I'm really excited today to be here with Oscar HORTA. Oscar is an animal activist, a philosopher at the University of Santiago de Compostela, and he's also one of the founders of the organization Animal Ethics. And more recently, Oscar, you've written a really amazing book, which I loved, called Making a Stand for Animals. So we're going to be talking about all of those things today and various other issues that we're going to cover. So yeah, I would like to formally introduce Oscar, my friend, and I didn't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about the book itself, the writing process, or...
Yeah, well, so basically, it's a book that I've been working on for a long time, and the idea really of it is not like if it were an academic book. It's not something very technical. It's conceived as the kind of book that you would want to give out to someone you want to learn more about animal advocacy, speciesism, the moral consideration of animals, veganism. So the kind of book that, you would give out as a present for someone's birthday or something. But I think it can also be useful for if you are interested in animal advocacy, if you are involved and want to learn more about the arguments you can use, about some considerations that can make you maybe a better animal activist, maybe, or whatever, that can be useful. The idea at any case is that it's written in a language that is very accessible. It's not, a book that is pretentious in any way, just presenting the basic facts and arguments in a way that most people will understand.
Okay, Oscar, could you maybe tell people a little bit about the book and where they can get it? Where they can get a copy online or ebook or a hard copy?
And if you want the book, well, there are different things you can do. But at this point, I think you can buy it on Routledge with a discount. So there is a 30% discount, but I don't know how long it will last. But then if you buy it before the end of the year, you can get a 20% discount. And with a code that you can find at the Animal Ethics website. There is a post about this book where you can find the discount code, or else there is a way that you can get it if you are in the US, which is by making a donation to Animal Ethics, and Animal Ethics will send you the book. Other than this, if you want the book and if you have no money and you want, please, Oscar, can I get the book? Maybe we can find a way to get that done in some way, but don't say it too loud. I mean, this this is something
I will leave a link.
The viewer.
I'll leave a direct link in the description box below the YouTube video, so you can go directly onto those links to purchase Oscar's book, Making a Stand for Animals. It really is a wonderful book, so definitely get your hands on that while you can. And one of my favorite things about this book, as I mentioned to you, was the individual stories you use to illustrate some of the points, and also the various thought experiments which run through the book. One of my favorite ones was actually the red button thought experiment. I was just wondering if you could quickly walk the viewers through that thought experiment, maybe how you came up with it and what its implications are.
Yeah, so basically the thought experiment goes like this. So suppose that where you live, there were some kind of red buttons all around that people would press. And when you press them, two things happen. So the first one is that you feel some pleasure and, I don't know, some pleasurable experience, whatever. And then the second thing that happens is that some animal, maybe one animal or maybe several animals, will suffer terribly for a very long time, and then they will be killed. And the fact is that most people do press this button several times a day. But then it just so happens that there are other buttons around, blue buttons that you can also press. And they will also give you these pleasurable experiences, maybe a bit different from the others, but nevertheless quite similar and quite good anyway. And it just so happens that when you press these blue buttons, there is no animal that is going to suffer, no animal that's going to die. So it seems intuitive that most of us would want to press the blue button instead of the red button. And the thing is, nevertheless, that this is not just, you know, a fantasy example. This happens, actually. The red and the blue buttons are real, are everywhere around us, because when we choose to harm animals by eating them or by using them in other ways, it's like we are pressing those red buttons. And of course, people may say, well, but, you know, we've been pressing the red buttons, you know, in such a long time, and, you know, blue buttons, you know, they're fine, but they're not just the same, you know. And
Yeah.
oh, these blue buttons defenders, they are
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are the kind of like reasons that people would give not to press the blue button and continue to press in the red ones. So the idea here is that, you know, yeah, as I said, why pressing the red buttons when the blue are around? And it seems that there is really no difference with what happens in reality. So yeah, I don't know if the experiment is that good. I mean, I just thought that it could be useful to think about this.
I really like it. Like, I think it was probably one of my favorite aspects of the book. I like it because when you ask people this question, and I've tested it out on a few people without giving them context of actually you do this in real life. If you just ask them the question, 10 out of 10 times they'll say, I'll push the blue button. I don't want to kill an animal, because they're thinking of a dog or a cat, or maybe they're even thinking of farm animals. I don't know. And then when you say, but actually you do it in real life because of X, Y, Z, and then it makes them realize the contradiction. So I think it's good in that sense. And also because it really draws attention to the fact that the way you word it in the book is that it's a trivial pleasure that you get. It's not like it's going to save your life. It's not, you know, going to produce this, all of a sudden you eat a hamburger and it's going to produce a really meaningful lifelong relationship. People often don't draw enough attention to the fact that it is a trivial pleasure and you're not gaining something significant from it. And that, I think, makes the moral atrocity of consuming animals and harming them even worse.
Yeah, but also, like, suppose that you think that it's essential to your life to press the button. Well, but even if it's essential, what's essential really for you is to press a button. So you have the chance to press the blue one. Of course, you need to eat something, but you just don't need to eat animals. You can eat something else.
Yeah, yeah. And even like legal cases illustrate that starvation is not a rationale or justification for murder. Like there's a famous, I think it's Dudley versus Stevens or something like that. And these 3 or 4 men were on an island and they basically have to eat each other to survive. And the medical records showed that if they didn't eat this one person, they wouldn't have survived. And they tried to use that as a defense for murder. And the judge just said, you can't just eat someone because you're hungry, basically, in a more legal, sophisticated way. But it kind of also shows that even if it's not a trivial gain that you get from harming someone else, it's still not a justification for it. Because a lot of people still say, oh, if I was starving or something like that. But if you were starving, you still wouldn't eat a 3-year-old child, surely. Or at least intellectually you recognize it's wrong. So yeah, we could still apply the same principle here.
Mm-hmm.
You spend some time in the book defining and explaining the term omnivore. And I think that's really important because a lot of the time in the literature and in just the general discussion about it, there's a lot of misunderstanding as to what omnivore actually means. So my understanding is that it just means a human body can consume something without dying, basically. So we could consume an airplane, really, but that doesn't mean that's what we're going to be optimal for. And that also doesn't mean that's what we should be doing just because our body can process it. Because there's just a lot of misunderstanding within, like among vegans and animal rights people, and just in general about what it actually means to be an omnivore.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so there's this confusion about what omnivore means, with many people thinking that if you are an omnivore, that means that you have to eat both plants and animal products, and maybe other products as well. Like, I don't know, because we eat many other things, not just plants and all that. We may eat fungi and bacteria and whatnot. But this is wrong anyway. If you are an omnivore, what that means is that you can eat a bunch of different things. Not only that, in fact, it doesn't really mean that. What it means is that our ancestors typically eat that, or typically ate that. To say, for instance, that a dog is a carnivore doesn't mean that a dog needs to eat meat, or otherwise the dog will die, because there are vegan dogs who have a great health. So it just means that typically these animals have been eating other animals. And if you are an omnivore, what that really means is that typically your ancestors were eating different kinds of foods, including animal foods and also other foods. And what it means for us is that we can survive and we can be in good health, even if we eat very different things. Someone can be in a good health eating animal products, and someone can, can be healthy eating just plants and not animal products.
I think a lot of the people who think just because we are this, we have to do this, it can be, we'll talk about the appeal to nature in a little while, but I think it's kind of linked to that way of thinking, just because I'm able to do something, or just because it's natural for my body to do it, I should be doing it. When really it's people like me and you think that the question is more, is it ethical and is it sustainable, rather than is it just natural? One of my main interests in your work is you're one of the sort of the academic pioneers of wild animal suffering. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking about that. And we both agreed initially we should begin optimistically and give examples of how we might intervene with nature, that some things that have already been done that we've succeeded at. So I think things like animal vaccinations in some populations have been trialed with moderate success. I don't know if you had other examples, just to show that it can, this is an achievable thing. It's not so far out of reach as a lot of people think.
Yeah, so let me first start by mentioning one thing that I think it's really important to have like a background of why I think this is relevant. So many people think that when we are harming others, then we are doing something that is wrong. But we are also wronging others when, for instance, they are in need of help and we refuse to help them. So in the case of human beings, this is quite clear, right? So it seems that our duties towards others are not just duties of not harming them. And actually, often the difference between harming someone and refusing to, free someone from a harm is not really that clear. I mean, there is a continuum there, so to speak. So then what happens is that if you are against speciesism, if you reject the discrimination of non-human animals, then it seems that you shouldn't have a different attitude when it comes to non-human animals and when it comes to humans. So it's just not right to have an ethics for human beings and another ethics for other sentient beings. There is just one ethic, and that ethic should lead you to have the same concern for everyone. Now, the good news then is that there are people who are actually applying this when it comes to non-human animals. So if you consider animals that are in the wild and that are in need of help, the fact is that if you watch the news, for instance, every now and then, you'll learn about cases where human beings are helping other animals. For instance, they may be animals that are drowning, maybe. It may be drowning in just ponds. They may be small animals drowning there. Or, I don't know, trapped in mud ponds, for instance. Or when there are like some floods. I've seen some cases of this occurring, for instance, in Australia, where you are. And people are rescuing animals that would drown there otherwise. When there are wildfires, in cases where there are other natural disasters. So a bunch of different cases where animals are helped. So you mentioned already some cases, and I think that the best example here may be that of wild animal vaccination programs. We can speak a bit about them later if you want. But then there may be other examples. I mentioned natural disasters. So in addition to having people who individually, out of their own initiative, help animals, There are other things that can be done, such as designing and implementing protocols for rescuing animals in cases like these. Then also, a very good example of ways in which we can help these animals can occur not out there in the wild, but for instance, in urban areas or suburban areas or agricultural areas or, I don't know, industrial areas, or also places that are semi-wild, like for instance, some forest that is not a forest that just has grown like it is maybe in some natural way, but it's something that it's a forest we've created. We've planted those trees maybe for logging or something. And in those places, there are going to be animals. And these are areas that are heavily populated by humans, or humans have a very significant presence there. So this means that these places are very easy for us to monitor. So if we help animals there, it's going to be very easy for us to, or easier at least, to study how the effects of our efforts develop through time. And there are many different ways in which we can do this. In the case of urban animals, for instance, animals like pigeons or small animals living in parks, there may be many different ways in which we can help them.
I liked how you said at the start, like the rationale for helping wild animals, because it's not just about what you don't do, it's about the positive duties as well. So not just negative rights, but the positive duties. And I think we're definitely seeing that shift in the academic literature as well. It's gotten less, because we've kind of established what we should be doing, like murdering and torturing them. And now it's more of a political, I guess, almost shift to what duties do we actually owe to not just farm animals to stop killing them and mass breeding them, but also how do we help these animals that are suffering en masse in nature. And you mentioned institutional kind of help. I agree with that as well. So for one of the main arguments in my thesis, and I want to elaborate upon it in my PhD, is, well, in the thesis, I said that we should be utilizing more almost like military power, like we call it the defense power in the Australian Constitution, to help animals. And when I first tell people that, like in the presentations I had to do, everyone, the initial reaction was like, this is so radical, like you're insane. But then I can give the example of the Australian bushfires, where they actually deployed the military to feed koalas and rescue them and things like that. And then once you sort of give an example of how it happened, it's easier to understand how it should happen more. And they're like, oh, okay, so they're already using the military to help animals. I was like, yeah, so all my argument is let's do that like way more, though, like just a lot more. And I think that could be a real, avenue to help animals. I mean, it's controversial because people are against, war, and like the military is just a contentious issue. But I think that is one real way that it could happen. And I saw that, visibly during the Australian bushfires, which was a huge deal in, the country I live in. The first issue is sort of the extent of the suffering, because I personally have a lot of trouble conveying just how bad it is. Like you can mention things like parasites and starvation and predators, but it's hard to really convey to them the scale and the degree and why it's wrong, because they're still stuck in this idea that it's just nature. So do you find that as a challenge, and any tips?
As for the use of the military to help wild animals, well, for sure, I think everyone will agree, or everyone should agree at least, that would be a way better use of the military than the standard ones. So if you have these guys who have been trained and equipped to harm other human beings, and you use them instead to help wild animals, well, that's a huge change for the better. So yeah, I guess everyone should agree with this. And the fact is that the examples, like for instance, the case you mentioned, it's a very good example, but many other examples can come to mind. And for sure, natural disasters can be a perfect one, though by no means it should be the only one. Okay. Yeah, I guess I would say this about these issues. And as for your actual questions, sorry, because I'm tackling lots of points at a time. But yeah, as for your question, I think that you hinted already something very important here, which is that both when it comes to speaking about the harms the natural harms that animals suffer in the wild, and what we can do to help them, I think it's very useful and important actually to point at actual ways in which this happens, pointing at the examples, the particular cases where in which we can see this going on, rather than an abstract and difficult to understand case about it that just appraise it like in a very general, broad and unclear way. So if you just say, well, animals are suffering out there in the wild and maybe we could help them, people may be like, I don't know if this is a good idea. I mean, it's only natural that this happens. I don't know, why should we get involved? But then when you present them the actual ways, for instance, in which we are helping them, such as the ones we mentioned before, rescuing animals that are trapped or are drowning, I don't know, helping animals in natural disasters or improving the lives of animals in urban areas, saving animals' life by providing them some medical treatment or some vaccine against diseases that would otherwise make them suffer terribly and die when they are very young. When you present each of these specific cases, I mean, most people agree that these things are great. And something similar can happen when we consider the suffering of animals. So you can present specific cases of specific animals suffering, or specific ways in which they suffer. So, for instance, when winter comes and the rain comes and snow comes, we want to be indoors because, suffering from the cold out there, from the rain and the snow, that's not really that nice. And we may think, well, maybe we are no longer adapted to standing those things, but for animals, it's just fine. And the thing, what happens is that this is not so. Animals are, of course, affected as well by the cold or by, for instance, by the heat as well. And you can actually see that in that their mortality rates are radically affected when the weather becomes a bit colder or a bit too hot for them. So we may think, well, but animals, they are adapted to their environment, so they live in the environment that is better for them. But while there is some truth in this somehow can lead us to forget something very important there. So consider a certain population that spreads through a certain area. What happens is that maybe this area may range from north to south, and there may be places where these animals are no longer able to live because the weather there, the climate is too extreme for them. And there may be some place, maybe somewhere in between, in the center of the area where they live, in which they are not really severely affected by the weather. But the thing is that animals reproduce. They have children. I mean, people don't typically speak of children when they speak about animals. They say, oh, the offspring and whatever, but yeah, we can speak of their children as well. So anyway, so these animals will spread, will try to live in other new areas. They'll try to live wherever they can. So what happens is that there will always be animals at the margins, animals that are living just at the borders at which they can live. And that means that as soon as the conditions there become a bit harsher, they won't make it. But even if the conditions where animals are not harsh enough for them to die, well, they are causing them suffering anyway. Like, for instance, you may be standing in very cold weather and you're not going to be killed by it, but you're not going to be fine. You're going to be suffering due to that. Yeah. And the same happens if you consider not just harsh weather, but any other factors affecting how good or bad your life can be. It may be food availability. It may be, for instance, I don't know, well, another factor like parasitism or disease, It may be that the disease won't kill you, but anyway, it will make you suffer significantly. So in a way, mortality can be used as an indicator of how much suffering there is in a certain area. So when there is a lot of mortality in a certain population, you can assume that those who are not dying are nevertheless also suffering a great deal out of that. if it's like a disease, cold or whatnot. So because this is continuous, I mean, there are many different factors affecting the well-being of animals. Like, I just mentioned a few of them. But there may be some others. It's not just the weather, disease, parasitism, lack of food or water, or there may be other factors like accidents they may suffer, injuries, or for instance, factors that wouldn't affect us, like a change in the salinity of a certain environment. We don't care that much about that, but for certain animals, that can be deadly, that can be terrible. Or I don't know, if there is some dry weather, suppose that a frog lays her eggs in a certain pond, and then it just so happens that that spring there is no much rain and the pond just dries out, and the tadpoles will come out of the eggs. They will be there swimming, trying to get food, and they will all die just because the pond dries out. So again, maybe the fact that it doesn't rain that much is not really affecting our well-being that much, but for them, it's a matter of life or death. So, I mean, there are other considerations having to do with, population dynamics and so on. But if you want, maybe we can speak about that later. But, because I don't want each answer that I give to your question to last half an hour. But there is
it's all interesting and it's all really important. So if the answers are long, that's great. It's really interesting because you bring attention to the fact that the standard is so different when we think about what makes a good life for humans and even domesticated animals. And the standard for us is pretty high now, especially in the free world. But the standard for wild animals is like, oh, they're surviving, so they're pretty good, like animal survival in the wild. That's kind of the standard. If they're not dying, they must be okay. That's kind of the general attitude. I don't get from everyone, but a lot of people in the mainstream and even in academia. So you go through the story of Teresa the cow in your book. It kind of reminds me of my answer to what I find effective in terms of trying to convey the scale of the suffering and why we should help wild animals is, I don't know who I got it from. Someone told me once, would you give unnatural medicine, which is all medicine, to a dying child, even if it was unnatural? And the answer is always yes, unless the person's a psychopath. And then the next question is, why would you not apply the same logic to someone in the wild, like an animal in the wild? And that's actually the most effective way I've gotten to start the conversation, is to tackle a really big question, to individualize it, which is what you kind of do with some of the stories, which are true stories in your book. For example, with Teresa the cow. I was meant to ask you this at the start of the video, but I forgot, so we can sort of go through it now, if that's okay. Did you just want to say a little bit about that approach?
So well, basically the case of Teresa or Teresa, she's well, to be honest, I don't know if she's still alive, but I have no reason to think she died, though it's difficult to get information about this because she ended up in an animal sanctuary, but she was living in a farm in Sicily where the animals were being killed because there were some brucellosis, epidemic or something like that, and she ran away, and she ran for several miles until she got to the sea, and then they were almost getting her, so she jumped onto the water, and she was swimming there, and she swam for a very long time until eventually they caught her. The Coast Guard caught her, and then they were going to kill her. So there was this campaign, this international campaign led by Italian activists, but also by activists in other places, and eventually they decided not to kill Teresa and to carry her to this sanctuary. Now, the interesting thing here is that whenever you tell this story to anyone, most people, they feel strong sympathy for this animal, and they think it's great that this happened to this animal. But then, I mean, her story is not really that different. I mean, well, it's peculiar because she ran away and all that, but she's just like any other animal of those who are regularly killed for people to eat every single day. And that seems like, okay, be telling us something. So if we care about this animal, we should care about the other animals as well. And I'm saying now this animal and avoiding using her name, because you know, when you name an animal, it's like you single that animal out, you single it up, or single her or him, or apart from the rest of the animals. So that's why I'm choosing now to say this animal and these other animals, because they are all the same. So you know, these other animals who will never be rescued and who will die and who will never get individual names, maybe, you know, they deserve just the same. So I think that something similar happens. So in this case, we are talking about animal exploitation. But as you mentioned before, the same happens when it comes to wild animals. It's just the same thing, because after all, I mean, domesticated animals, animals used for exploitation, or wild animals, they are just the same animals. I mean, a pig or I don't know, some wild boar, you know, a cow or some wild buffalo, some chicken or some bird, it's just the same. So the harms they suffer matter for them just as much. And in fact, it's interesting because sometimes we have this attitude in that when it comes to harming animals, we see a problem. When it comes to helping them, we don't see it as that urgent. And that's all because it's all relating to us. So because we have this relationship, we have certain duties to them. Because we don't have this relationship, we don't have that duty to them. It's all us. And I think we should reject that. It's not about us, it's about them, it's about the animals. So we should help wild animals for the same reasons, exactly for the same reasons. We shouldn't eat them because they have interests of their own. And we should, you know, we should act in the ways in which their interests are satisfied, are met, rather than thwarted. So that's why I think that just the same that I mentioned now, in the case of Teresa the cow, can be said in the case of wild animals, as you were saying. So if helping this particular individual who is suffering for a natural disease or whatever, some other natural factor, is okay in this case, it should be okay in the case of the rest of the individuals who may be affected by these natural causes, including all wild animals.
Yeah, no, it's explained nicely. The Teresa the cow story is especially effective, I think, because this is another growing area, I guess, in the advocacy and literature of animal resistance. So it's not just we shouldn't harm them, it's the fact that they're actively resisting. Because usually, or historically, when we've oppressed another, whether it's a human being or an animal, there's this idea that they're just passive agents. You know, they willingly go to it, almost like the humane slaughter propaganda that is perpetuated. But the Teresa the cow story shows that, you know, they're active agents and they just have a desire for life, and they resist captors and abuse. So that's another important element, I think, in addition to like the individualization of these stories. That because not everyone, you know, myself, I'm convinced by stories like that, but I'm also more convinced by, you know, data and logic and it's just stats, I guess. But a lot of people are more emotional, and we can't underestimate how powerful these individual narratives can be as well. How important do you think it is to refute the appeal to nature fallacy, and how much damage do you think the worship of nature has been in our society in general for animals, assuming you agree that nature is like fetishized almost or idealized, which I definitely think it has been to a large extent?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So yeah, basically the idea that if something is natural, then that means that that's good. It's really widespread, and it's inconsistent with other views that most people have, because everyone would agree that, you know, disease is something bad, and that dying prematurely is something bad, that reading is something good, which is something extremely unnatural, that having hospitals is something good, again, something really natural.
Yeah.
So, in those cases are like in cases where what's at stake is what we value in our own lives. Things like, avoiding disease, avoiding suffering, avoiding premature death, wanting to have, a comfortable environment, having access to culture, being able to, I don't know, meet people from distant places like we are now, speaking, even if we live in the opposite side of the world. All these kind of things we value in our lives. But then when it comes to other individuals, like individuals who don't have access to all these fancy things in our lives, then we think, well, yeah, it's just great that they don't have these fancy things because, not having them is natural for them. Wait a minute. So what you are saying is that for these animals having these lives full of hardships, that's nice because it's natural. For us, having these great, comfortable lives, that's very desirable, even if that's totally unnatural. There's something going on there that is really wrong. So basically, the idea that something is natural, what does that mean? It means, well, maybe that this is the result of a Darwinian evolutionary process in combined with, physical process going on in the world in which we live in concerning our physical environments. Well, the fact that something is the result of such a process doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. I mean, some things may come out of that may be good. Some others would be totally neutral, and some others may be very bad. And actually, I can come up with an example of something that is the result of natural processes that is extremely bad. And this is the way in which most animals reproduce. So it's true that there are some animals, like, for instance, us, great apes, or other animals like certain birds, like albatrosses and certain other animals, they reproduce by having maybe one offspring or one child at a time. And they provide this new individual with parental care, and they take care then of this individual, and they reduce, therefore, the chances that this new sentient being will suffer and die. But then what happens is that the vast majority of animals don't reproduce like this. Rather, they reproduce by having huge amount of offspring. And what happens is that on stable populations, on average, only one of these animals will survive and make it to maturity and reproduce again. Because otherwise it would be an exponential growth, a boom in the population of these animals. But this doesn't happen or doesn't typically happen. So what happens then to the other animals? Well, most of them die before reaching maturity, and many of them may die shortly after coming into existence, and often in painful way, like they will be, I don't know, killed by maybe, as I said before, by the cold, or when the pond where you were born dries out, or where, where the salinity of the environment changes. Again, I'm coming back to this example of the salinity because I think it's clear to pointing at factors that we don't usually imagine. Or, for instance, you may starve to death. I mean, there are many animals who never eat. They come into existence and they want to eat, but they never found any food, so they died. And these deaths can be very, very painful. And because these animals die when they are very young, they don't have the time to have positive experience to kind of counterbalance that, meaning that the net level of happiness against suffering in their lives is very negative. I mean, suffering really prevails in their lives. And this may happen to many animals. Maybe, I mean, we don't know about this. It's very difficult to make a clear assessment of this. But maybe the majority of them have lives where suffering prevails. And this is the result of an evolutionary process, because there are limited resources plus natural selection equals many animals, many sentient beings won't make it. Only a minority will make it. Is this
Yeah.
good? Of course, it's not good. This is horrible. The fact that
Yeah.
suffering prevails in the life of an individual, this is not a good thing. It's a terrible thing. And the fact that this may even be prevalent, this is horrible. This is really, really bad. And it can give us also an idea of how important it can be for us to help these animals. So considering all this, overall, I think that a good case may be to claim that the fact that something is natural is telling us absolutely nothing about how good or bad that thing is. And this is based also on, of course, this is based on empirical considerations, but, you know, even if I hadn't mentioned all these things, even if I hadn't provided this explanation and come up with all these examples, there is something more basic in that there is no conceptual connection between something being the result of some natural process and that being good. There is no relation at a conceptual level there either.
I will respond. I just have to go and close my bedroom window because ironically, I have a baby bird in there. It was actually being attacked by 2 massive crow predators. And my sister and I saw him on the road and just stopped and just got him, and he can't fly. So we just have to, they're really high maintenance birds. You have to feed them every 3 hours and make sure the room temperature is right and stuff. I'll be like 2 seconds.
Go, please.
It's really important that you said that the norm is suffering. And just one statistic I read was, I think it's rabbits in the Arctic or somewhere very cold, 60% of their species just dies in the winter. Like that was just one example. So it really is scientifically and empirically the case that the majority of most wild animals' lives is suffering rather than well-being. And so an example of the worship of nature, I guess, even just something like David Attenborough documentaries, you know, I think they're amazing. Obviously, he's obviously great at what he does, but documentaries like that, people watch them and think they're obviously not documenting the animals that are dying. The majority of them that are dying, they're showing like the 1% of a tiger family that managed to survive in the wild. And people look at that and think like, oh, yeah, they have some problems like other predators, and, you know, sometimes their baby will go missing, but it seems mostly good. And I'm an example of that. Up until I found your work and, you know, other people in this area, I honestly thought that the lives of wild animals weren't that bad. And occasionally a deer would be eaten, but it seemed like a small price to pay for the supposed freedom they had. I don't know, people that are seemingly educated can still not know about this. It's just a huge problem. And I think it stems from this idea that nature is good and beautiful. And I don't really know the different aspects of why it is the way it is. I think it's an aesthetic thing as well. So people see like the beauty of nature and don't go any further what's actually inside the forest and the animals that live there. I think environmental values and environmentalism in general played a really big part in kind of pushing a certain idea of nature and not telling the full reality. That combined with the fact that a lot of people are just kind of naturally selfish anyways. It's hard for them to look beneath, I guess the veneer of what the appeal to nature fallacy says, which you sort of spoke on already, and to the reality of the mass suffering underneath it. Did you want to just quickly distinguish between natural fallacy and appeal to nature, just so people know of that distinction?
Oh yeah, no, that's a really important one because people typically confuse those. So the appeal to nature is this idea that what's natural is good, or nature is good. So basically, this would be a fallacy if you are using that in an argument, just assuming that something is good because it's natural, because it's the result of some natural process. It doesn't necessarily to be a fallacy. It can be an argument that the argument may not be a good argument, but nevertheless, if you are explicit in saying, well, you know, I think that because of this reason and this reason, you know, something being natural is good. And of course, I would disagree with that for the reasons we mentioned. But if you are putting it in that way, then it's just an argument that I think is wrong, but not necessarily a fallacy. It would be a fallacy when you are somehow assuming that the appeal to nature really is an appeal to goodness or to correctness. Yeah, that's different from something that is in philosophy. It's called the naturalistic fallacy. Yeah, and the naturalistic fallacy is something else entirely. I'm not really gonna get into detail, but it has to do with a debate in meta-ethics, in moral realism. There are some people who claim that that when you say we should do something, you are expressing a prescription that can be objectively right or wrong, whereas other people would say, well, no, it's right or wrong, but it can be right or wrong depending on our attitudes, on the attitudes of agents, not independently of our attitudes. And some people would say, well, no, it's, prescriptions, they don't really, they aren't really proposition, they are just expressing our attitudes, or, well, these are just a few positions. There are several others. But then there is this idea that, no, there are things that are correct, actions that are correct in themselves, independently of our attitudes, and this is so because they have some moral properties, and the moral properties can be identified with natural properties. So a natural property, like for instance, causing suffering, that's by natural we mean here occurring in the world. So if something causes suffering, then that means that that's wrong, and it's the same thing, the natural property and the moral property, whatever. Anyway, we don't need to get into detail about this.
That was thorough.
Can
I just ask out of curiosity, are you a moral realist or an anti-realist?
Okay, so I'm an anti-realist, and let me explain why. The thing is, I believe that so basically we have, I'll put it this way, maybe this is going to be a shorter explanation. We have no evidence that moral properties are around there, only our intuitions. But then we have an evolutionary explanation of why we have these intuitions, even if this intuition doesn't correspond with anything being out there that is real. Now, what's the point with this? Some people will think, well, if you are not a moral realist, then you are assuming that everything goes. So we have no reason whatsoever to act in ways that we consider morally correct or morally wrong, because they are not objectively correct or wrong. And I totally disagree with that. Because, for instance, some people claim, well, that means that I can behave in selfish ways, and I don't need to care about others because I have no objective obligation to do this. And I would go, wait a second, but you have no objective permission either to be selfish. Because if you are a moral anti-realist, you are denying that anything is objectively prohibited or objectively permissible. So you have no reason to be selfish, because no objective reason to be selfish. And you may say, well, I have a subjective reason to be selfish. Okay, but you have a subjective reason not to be selfish. Your appeal to the lack of objectivity gives you no reason whatsoever to justify any view. And in my view, actually, the rejection of realism gives us a reason to be morally impartial, because that means that you have no objective reason to be altruistic, but then you have no objective reason to be selfish either. Meaning that because you have no objective reason to benefit anyone in particular, you have no objective reason to benefit yourself. Given that, I believe that you should be impartial. Now, of course, in addition to that, I have other considerations. And what's important here is that it doesn't really matter whether you are a realist or not when it comes to recognizing reasons to help others. Actually, I know many people, and like in the literature, you go to the philosophical literature and you see the people who are moral realists. And most of them are speciesists, of course. And they claim, no, it's an objective fact that we should behave in these ways and these ways. And the ways in which they claim it's an objective fact that we should behave are horrible speciesist ways, of behaving. And the fact is that the same arguments that you would have to care about all sentient beings apply in just the same strong way, whether you are a moral realist or a moral anti-realist. Like the argument from species overlap, the argument from relevance. What's relevant for caring about others is how we can affect them with our actions. And you can affect with our actions anyone who's sentient. So this means that you should care for sentient beings. it doesn't matter if you're a moral realist or a moral anti-realist, because you will accept the premises because the premises are so intuitive. You should accept the conclusion, regardless of whether you think that this conclusion is a proposition that is objectively true, a proposition that is subjectively true, or is not a proposition. It's just some expression of our attitudes. I mean, I could speak a lot more about this, but I mean, I have many examples of particular people who are anti-realist and who just live their lives trying to make the world a better place, and of people who claim that I'm a moral realist and behaving
and not doing jack shit.
So I don't think that really makes a difference. I don't know what.
Yeah, no, I don't think it does either. I mean, it'd be nice to say that there's somehow these magical objective properties of the world that tell us what is morally right and morally wrong objectively. So emotionally, I understand why people are attracted to moral realism, but intellectually, I can't honestly get there, where I can say, oh, actually, I found this and this tells me I'm not religious, so I can't appeal to any kind of higher power, which ultimately is what I find moral realists do without some try to get out of it. I don't know if you know Sam Harris. He's like a public intellectual. He's a very famous atheist, and his whole thing is like suffering is bad and well-being is good, and those are the moral objectives. But even then, if you can deduce it down to something, it's still his own values. So I don't understand how that gets out of the anti-realist way of thinking. I think he makes a lot of good points, and I understand the framework, but he's trying to transcend this is or dichotomy. Like you can draw a value from a fact, which I don't think he's done. So I'm not. I always describe myself as emotionally, I'm a moral realist, but intellectually, I'm an anti-realist just because I'm not. I'm like you. I'm not really convinced by any kind of argument that gets us to a place where we can objectively say something is right or wrong without appealing to a higher power, which I don't believe in. So your article refuting, or I guess challenging, one of the views that Donaldson and Kimlicka put forward in the Polis about animal sovereignty is questioning whether, sorry if I'm not exactly interpreting it correctly, you can correct me if you like, challenging this idea that the majority of wild animals can have sovereignty at all because the state of nature is so failed that you need some kind of like standard of an environment and of well-being to even have sovereignty over your own life and body. So I thought that was really important because I guess I do see nature as a failed state. I don't see it, this might be controversial, but I don't see it as much, I don't see it in many shades different from a place like North Korea, a really horrible regime. It's just one is human-made and the other is, natural or constructed by nature somehow. But yeah, I think that's also an important fact to try and get to, that animals can't actually, on my view, have the sovereignty that a lot of philosophers speak of until they're at a certain level in their environment, and which also affects their own bodies. So I think that was kind of one of the points you made in that article about Donaldson and Kimlicka's work. But you can sort of correct that if you need to. Right.
So basically, I mean, I would it's not really that I would agree with their idea that we should respect and take care of some animals out of considerations regarding of whether they are citizens in our communities or denizens or so on. So I wouldn't really quite agree with their background theory. I would be more sympathetic, for instance, with the proposal by Alistair Cochrane of a cosmopolitan account there. I think that the idea that we should care for some animals because they are living in our community strikes me as, extremely counterintuitive, because the animals, they are, why should we, be caring about them out of that contingent fact? It's not their fault that they lived in a certain community or not. And I wouldn't think that that's a good framework either for human beings themselves. This thing with having different states, maybe nation states or maybe other types of states, and that we have special obligations towards those who are citizens in our states. I don't think I have the slightly higher reason to care for someone who, was born, 10 meters or 10 kilometers from where I was born. I don't have any more reason at all to care for that human individual than for care for a human individual who was born in the other part of the world. And there is no reason whatsoever why I should be more bounded to someone who just so happened to be a citizen in the same state where I have, from which I have a nationality. No reason at all.
Yeah.
So, given that I don't think this in the case of humans, I wouldn't have any reason to think it in the case of non-human animals. But in the case of non-human animals, I think that this view is even more unacceptable, because all this thing of states, nations, and the like, they're all creations that we have that have very little to do with animal communities at all. Anyway,
sorry,
yes,
I just want to ask, do you agree that even though they're creations, that can potentially be helpful in the same way, creating the Commission of Human Rights or something could be helpful for certain humans because they have different capacities and whatnot? Or is it just a bad idea because it forms like stuff, or it prioritizes like this proximity? Like if you're closer to someone, you should help them. But you know what I mean? Like I still think it could still be helpful in like a political, like practical ethics kind of sense. Or do you not sort of?
Yeah, so I think that there can be different ways in which it can be helpful. But I think that overall it's problematic. And that, so for instance, you may, this is driving us far really from the main topic here, but it has to do with human politics. But I can perfectly understand how, for instance, some people may have some cultural features whose protection they have interest in, and that the best way to protect these cultural features is by having some political community there, right? So for instance, where I live, I live in a place called Galicia, where I have a map of Galicia there, of part of Galicia here. And, there is this language that is called Galician, is the language I speak with my friends at my university. And, it's a minority language. And because Galicia is part of Spain, and Spain, there is Spanish, that is the main language. So, as a speaker of this language, I may have some interest in having the interests of certain individuals, the individuals who, like me, speak the language respected, and so having a political community in Galicia that can respect and promote this can then be helpful for Galicians and such. Well, fair enough. I totally get that point, and I think it's very reasonable. I mean, on the other hand, what we are seeing in the world in which we are living is that many of the problems within the Homo sapiens species have to do exactly with this, that people care more about individuals that are living in their own community or are living very close to them, and they don't care or actually consider their enemies people living in other places. So I think that combating this somehow and preventing the harms that are derived from this is more important overall than the other thing. Anyway, I don't think really this is that important. I was just mentioning this just to say that I don't agree with the framework that Donaldson and Kinlika have concerning human affairs to start with. But anyway, you may disagree with me, and you may think that human communities are important, and that it's important that humans are organized in, Westphalian nation states or whatever. But I don't think that necessarily means that you need to accept the position they have when it comes to wild animals. So one consideration there would be that while there are some animals who form communities in the wild, many animals don't form those communities. Many animals are, individualistic. And for them, it really makes no difference at all that we respect their political decisions. Then, more deeply than that, there is a further consideration that I think is the key here, which is that if we are speaking about respecting animals, I think that the guiding reason to do that is that we want what's best for them. So we want to respect them because we don't want them to be harmed. So if we want to respect their sovereignty, my assumption would be that the reason for doing that would be that that's better for them. And if it's better for them to respect the sovereignty of political communities of non-human animals in the wild, then I would say, well, let's do it. But it just so happens that the reality is different for the reasons we saw already, because animals are harmed by a number of factors, because many animals, in fact, the majority of them may be suffering very significantly for reasons that maybe we can't prevent all of them, but maybe we can prevent some of them. And this is a consideration that clearly, in my way, prevails over other considerations concerning the sovereignty of animals and whatnot. So suppose that animals in a certain community are suffering terribly due to a certain disease or lack of food, and we can help them. And suppose that someone then makes the case of, well, we shouldn't help them because if we help them, we are disrupting their sovereignty. We should let them deal with their own issues. And as a result of that, they suffer terribly, and 50–60% of them die, and the others who don't die nevertheless suffer a great deal. And is this better for this animal? I would say, come on, give me a break. To see that this
and for me it's as simple as doing a logical consistency test. If you had humans in the same situation as the wild animals and they had the same quality of life, no one would say let's respect their sovereignty. I think that's ridiculous. And if they do, I would say that's insane. If that's the view they want to hold, and fine to keep it consistent. But I don't think it's a reasonable position to have, given the quality of life is so bad for so many wild animals. Okay, I think that pretty adequately answers the question. Yeah, it's interesting, all that Jonathan and Kidmika stuff. We probably disagree on some of that, but it's probably too much to unpack in the remainder of this video. I may have misunderstood, but I thought it was more wild animals have slightly different needs, and animal citizens like dogs and cats have different needs because of the environments they're in. So we're going to build rights or whatever, rights and duties around those needs, and they kind of draw parallels to countries as well. But then I can see how do we only have human rights in this country but not this country because of whatever reason. So maybe I do agree more than I think I do, but I haven't got fully formed thoughts about it yet because I haven't heard that critique before of them specifically, because I heard the animal sovereignty one, your critique on that, but I haven't heard this before. So I think it's really interesting. It's new information for me. So yeah,
well, so I think that my previous point had to do with animals that on their account would be citizens in our community. So because the thing is, what they do is this: they think, okay, domesticated animals, they are citizens in our communities. Then we have wild animals who are living in areas where humans live or have a very significant impact, and these animals are going to be denizens. So for instance, animals that they call liminal animals, that in the scientific literature are often referred to as synanthropic animals because they live with humans in the same areas where humans live. So animals living in urban environments, animals living in agricultural areas, as I said before. And then there are wild animals, and with that wild animals, they form their own communities, and they are citizens of their own communities. So what I said was mainly, so I said two things. So first, I when I was speaking about the framework, if the framework worked for humans, what I was having in mind was animals that are citizens in our communities, like domesticated animals. Because what this means is that if domesticated animals are citizens in our communities, in human communities, then that means that there are domesticated animals that are Australian animals, domesticated animals that are, Russian animals, that are French animals. I think this is pointless. I don't think this can be right. I don't think that I have more obligation, so that it should affect me more what happens to domesticated animals in the place where I'm a citizen, in my country, rather than in other countries. That makes
I'm following it
sense
now.
to me.
Yeah, now I'm tracking it a bit better. So would you apply this critique or this position to like nation states as well? Like you don't think there should really be, separate nation states and people considered separate races and cultures and things like that? So it's like a universal human rights, animal rights view.
Yeah, so I would say that my homeland, so to speak, or my country or my nation is sentience. That really is where I belong. That's where I am home. And my co-citizens are all sentient beings. So that's I don't know, maybe it's a kind of poetic way of saying or whatever. But that really is what matters to me. And I'm saying this, even as I said before, even if I am a member of a community, whose culture and language is you can say that it's discriminated against. But anyway, and I see the point, and I can see how people. But this, even if my language is discriminated against, it's not that that's so bad for me or for people in Galicia. If you compare it with other human communities that are, being, the victims of, genocide and whatnot. But anyway, what I'm saying here is that I can see how sometimes it's convenient, and I don't think this is an easy thing. How is it convenient to think that, well, you identify yourself with a nation or with a community that gives you a sense of your own identity? I understand all that. But what I'm saying is that above all that, it's more important to be impartial and respect everyone who is sentient. I mean, not just human beings. I mean, any sentient being. I think that if we hold this view, the impact that this will have will be much better, even if, of course, the issue is not an easy one.
I think I agree on a very fundamental level that it's kind of Sam Harris's one of his main, points on like a lot of his work as well is he says that consciousness is what matters and it's the only thing that matters because everything that happens is happening inside the individual's brain. So on like a very basic starting point, I think I would agree with a lot of the argument you just put forward. Obviously, I have to think about it a little more because it's kind of the first time I'm hearing it. But yeah, just on that fundamental level, I do think consciousness also of sentience, I use it interchangeably, is really like literally the only thing that matters. So my position, and I guess yours as well, is that wild animals kind of need dramatic intervention. It's not going to be enough to just sweep up their lawns a little bit and give medicine here and there. It's a massive global issue and it needs, a lot of resources, a lot of money and attention. But it feels like, well, it doesn't feel like it is controversial to discuss these issues, especially with environmentalists, for example. I told you in one of our earlier conversations, I've had plenty of heated debates with environmentalists, and that's fine with me because I enjoy arguing, debating, having these type of discussions. But people often just get really upset because they're not used to hearing new ideas and having fundamental environmental values challenged. But at the same time, I kind of think that's exactly what we should be doing as well, because the only way to expose how bad something is to, they're not intentionally lying, but a lot of it is a very misleading representation of what the natural world actually is. So yeah, as I said to you before, some people in this area are reasonable, some are just really, really delusional to the point where I feel like it's almost like religious indoctrination, some of environmental values, because you can't challenge it and it's just formed the basis of who they are. So yeah, did you want to expand a little bit of your experiences on that or any particular views you have going forward with this tension?
Yeah, sure. So, okay, just to clarify, to start with. So, there are many ways in which we can help animals that doesn't necessarily require dramatically changing the environment. So many of the examples that we saw before don't have this implication. And there's no reason then why environmentalists should then oppose them. And also, by the way, even though, as we've seen, we have reasons to think that suffering really is hugely present in the wild, even if these weren't so, suppose someone challenges that assumption and thinks, well, for this, and these reasons, I think that happiness prevails in the wild. Even if you accept this, you can recognize that nevertheless suffering is present in the wild. And if we can avoid those cases where it's happening, when we can save animals who do have huge amount of sufferings in their life, when we can help them, then we should do that. So just a previous consideration about this. Then what if helping animals is something that we can do that requires a more significant effort? And what if it affects the way an ecosystem is? That is, by acting in a way that helps animals, you are changing somehow that environment. And you are somehow modifying a bit, or a bit or a lot, whatever, the ecological relationships that there are between different beings there. Well, to start with, it's important to clarify that it's not that those who want to help animals want to intervene in the wild or in nature, and those who don't, they don't want to do this. This is not so. I mean, conservationists are intervening in the wild all the time. I mean, conservation biology prescribes a number of interventions that they are applying all the time, and they're changing ecosystems all the time.
Yeah.
Not only that, we are also doing it. Humans are doing it all the time for anthropocentric reasons. I mean,
yeah,
we live in towns or in small villages. We have crops. We have a bunch of things. I mean, we build roads. We all the time are affecting. We are intervening in nature. So what's interesting here is that when we are intervening in nature for anthropocentric reasons or for environmentalist or conservationist reasons, then no challenge at all. When you want to change things for helping animals, not for helping humans, not for conservationist reasons, but for helping animals, then is when all the alarms, are fired. Well, wait a minute. That seems to be clearly.
Isn't it weird?
Yeah. What's the problem with you? I mean, you are totally agreeing with doing this when it comes to helping humans, but not when it comes to helping non-human animals. So that's
that's actually that whole idea of we're already intervening, so why don't we just intervene in a better way? That's probably one of the best arguments I've heard for helping wild animals, because it doesn't actually register that we are intervening every day with nature so badly. So why are you against, just even attempting to come up with these protocols and policies to help wild animals?
Yeah.
If harm is being done either way, you have to take the principle of indifference as opposed to the precautionary principle, because harm's going to be done either way. So you might as well take a chance on something that could succeed as opposed to letting harm happen anyway in the wild. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is your position that do you think that we don't need to confront environmentalist values to succeed in helping wild animals? Is this a short-term view, or is this just like a long-term thing that you don't think we need to bother them?
Yeah, so it's a bit complicated. So so basically the thing here is that there are many cases where we don't need to confront with them, where we can agree with them. Then there are other cases where actually collaborating with environmentalists can be very positive. And there can be other cases where we are going to confront. So let me just address it first at a more philosophical level, and then at a more practical one. So at a more philosophical level, what is environmentalism really? Well, environmentalism really is a family of views, all of them concerned with somehow the conservation of certain things in our environment. But there are different philosophies that can somehow be the underpinnings of it. So one can be just an anthropocentric view. You are anthropocentric and you just think that, for the sake of helping humans, it's better to, maintain some natural areas untouched or whatever, because this can be convenient for human beings, then you can have other views, like, for instance, ecocentrism. Ecocentrism is a form of holism, according to which the conservation of ecosystems, or maybe biocenosis, is good. Other form of holism would be concerned for the conservation, for instance, of species or populations or whatnot. Then other views are concerned with the conservation of wild areas, of the wilderness. And then there are other views that are called environmentalists, but are not really that environmentalists, which are biocentric views. So biocentric views, they hold it that it is living beings that matter, not just sentient beings, but living individuals, but not wholes like ecosystems and so ever. So I think that if you are a supporter of biocentrism, you would basically agree with all we said here, because non-human animals are sentient beings, and if you can help them, then you should help them. It's just that they would be concerned with other living beings as well, but they wouldn't necessarily oppose what we are saying. Now, what about holistic thinkers like environmentalists who are ecocentric? Okay, so these guys would oppose what you are saying when what you are saying would disrupt a certain ecosystem, but then they will have no reason to oppose helping wild animals in urban areas or agricultural areas that we are impacting and so on. And they would have no reason to oppose your intervention in a certain ecosystem when that doesn't really change the ecosystem. So we will confront with them when they will, for the sake of conserving a certain ecosystem, promote harming animals. Like, for instance, saying, well, you know, these animals, they are very numerous and they are changing the way this ecosystem is, and we want to maintain this ecosystem as it is, so we are going to kill these animals. We're going to say, no. We are concerned with what happens with these individual animals. So something like this happens, and this is an example that is in the book, actually, with wild horses in the Americas. So wild horses in the Americas, they, you know, in some countries, like in the US, they are exterminating them because they want to maintain the ecosystem as it was before horses were there. The reason is that horses are considered to be a foreign type of animal, a foreign species or whatever, because European invaders brought them when they got into Europe. Now, this is weird, because the reason why there weren't any horses when the Europeans got to Europe is that when the first humans got to America, when the first humans got into America, they exterminated the horses that were living in the Americas. So it seems kind of odd. What is the ecosystem in particular that you are prioritizing? It seems that there is something arbitrary there. But anyway, even if there was nothing arbitrary there, we're going to say, okay, these horses, they are sentient beings, they deserve respect, you shouldn't be harming them. And then it may be the other way around. It may be that, you know, there are animals who are suffering for natural reasons, and we can prevent those sufferings. We can help those animals. And then if you are a defender of ecocentrism and say, well, we shouldn't be doing it because we are changing the ecosystem as it is, because the ecosystem itself consists, among other things, of the suffering of these animals, then we should confront that. We shouldn't accept this, okay? And also the same thing happens in the case of views that want to conserve wild areas. Sometimes these views are called as natural-centric views. So we shouldn't accept these for reasons that we've seen already. In these cases, in the case of these views, there are many other areas, many other ways of helping animals that they would not oppose, because there are very few areas already that are still natural. Most of them are already created by human beings. Even forests are out there. So that means that according to this area, if in a forest that was planted by humans, you help animals, you are doing nothing wrong. But anyway, I think we need to confront them when there are these oppositions, at least at a theoretical level. So what happens then at a practical level? So what is the best way to promote that we eventually end up helping wild animals? So there are different tasks here, different things that we need to do. One of them is to spread the idea that these animals matter among animal advocates who are a leading force in the defense of animals. Then also we should start to educate the general public about this and try to influence people like policymakers. But then there is a very important place where we need to act, which is academia, especially in the field of natural science, because these are the fields where we need to do research to learn more about how to help animals. Fields like veterinary science, fields like biology, especially the science of ecology. We need to be, working there, spreading research there. So what happens is that because people working in those fields are anthropocentric, and many of them also are conservationists, conservation biology really is huge. It may be good to think of ways of collaborating with these people when it comes to doing research in these areas. And now actually trying to influence people who are conservationists to have a concern for the well-being of animals can mean that a huge amount of research ends up being done that otherwise will be dismissed. It will be neglected. So that's why, on a practical level, collaboration with people who may be conservationists in academia may be useful, among other things, because there is a lot of knowledge out there that we need to gain for the sake of, eventually helping wild animals. That is also interesting and useful for conservationists. So collaborating in getting this knowledge gained is something that helps them, but it also helps us when it comes to knowing better how to have an impact in the long term. So that's why I'm saying that this is very complicated, and the answer to these questions is not really straightforward.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate that. And that was really helpful, breaking down the different kind of environmentalist school of thought. And some are more sympathetic to the view that animals are sentient individuals who suffer, that require help. Others are less and more anthropocentric.
Yep.
I guess my main issue with a lot of the literature is that I haven't seen, so when I did my thesis, so I tried to read quite widely in different environmentalist literature, and I didn't see any pieces in the main schools of thought that treated animals as intrinsically morally valuable. And I think if we don't agree on that baseline, it will be hard to achieve kind of long-term goals with them. So that's kind of my main concern. And the solutions I've seen that are promising in a large scale kind of way to wild animal suffering, even though it's a little bit hard to get politically, but scientifically, I think we could achieve things like gene modification to scientifically weed out the diseases and parasites in a lot of animal populations. It would be difficult to get to a place where we could implement something like that without firstly agreeing that animals are intrinsically morally valuable, because no one would do that for someone they didn't find, or as a group of beings that didn't find morally valuable. That's just one example, but yeah, I just have this issue with it, with working with certain organizations, or just philosophically, how would I reconcile such an incompatible value, I guess. Also, just the environmental law and policies. I mean, it's just as bad as animal welfare, assuming that you think animal welfare has its downsides as well, which I definitely think it does. There's just all these problems that occur when the baseline of valuing sentience and individual rights doesn't, come about, I guess. Well, that would be my main sort of critique. Yeah.
Well, there are lots of questions that are very important.
I know it's complicated.
Yeah. So you've raised a whole bunch of topics that would be really necessary to address. So because we don't have time enough for all that,
that's all right.
I'll try to focus on a few things that I think are important.
You don't have to feel compelled to respond to every single thing, or you can just say oh yeah, it's interesting. We'll save it for another time. I know we've been talking for a little while, so if you're
no, it's okay. We can go on with this. So what I'll do is I'll just address a couple of issues that I think are especially relevant among the ones that you've raised. So one is that I do think that we need to be long-termists. And there is a confusion there because long-termism is sometimes, maybe often, identified by many people with the idea that we should care about the future of human beings or maybe the descendants of human beings. And I think this is wrong. Long-termism is just the idea that what happens in the long term is going to be very, very important, and we should care about that. And the basic argument for this is that, I mean, and this is an idea that is very simple, but has very, very important consequences. The future, or actually the far future, is going to be very, very long. And the near future or the present is just going to be a very tiny amount of time. And there are going to, on expectation, be huge amounts of sentient beings in the future, just because it's going to be so long in the far future. Way more animals in the far future than in the near future or the present. In fact, it may be that if the population of sentient beings increase, at any given point, there will be more individuals in the future than right now. But even if that doesn't happen, just because even if the population of sentient beings were reduced, for instance, suppose that human beings and other animals are never go out of Earth. So in the far future, we are still on Earth and we never leave Earth, which I don't know if that's going to happen. And it's very likely that that won't happen. But suppose that were the case. And suppose that the population of sentient beings were reduced. Even if that were the case, still way more animals in the future than in the long-term future than in the near future, due to which we should care about our actions in the long term. Because these animals, and this would be the second consideration, count just as much as animals living in the present. It's arbitrary to discriminate against someone just because of the time at which that individual lives. And because our actions have effects not just in the near future, but the effects of our actions will spread throughout the future, including the future at a very, very large scale. So this means that we need to design strategies that will have the best effect in the long term. This is why when we consider animal advocacy in general, I think that it would be better to focus on changes in attitudes rather than behaviors. So for instance, let me just put a simple example of this. Suppose that society in general cared much more about animals than it does today. That would be a better, that would put us in a much better situation to achieve changes in the future. Now, suppose instead that we lived in a society that cared just as much for non-human animals as it does today. But suppose that for whatever reason, industrial farming were less developed, so the number of animals killed in that hypothetical society were smaller. So when it comes to considering the present, it looks like the second situation would be very good, or not very good, but much better than the present situation in the real world. But then when you consider the far future, when you consider the long term, the second situation would be very similar to our situation, because eventually that society would develop industrial farming as our societies have. Whereas the first situation would be better located, because in that situation, even if animals are harmed, it seems that the prospect for changing that in the future is more significant because people care more about other sentient beings. So due to this, when it comes to designing a strategy in general for animal advocacy, so suppose, I think that changes in attitude can make a more important difference. So suppose, for instance, that I could do either of these two things. I can lead 10 people to challenge speciesism and to think speciesism is wrong. and to think that the consequences of speciesism are wrong, so we shouldn't be exploiting animals. We should be vegan, right?
Yeah.
But it just so happens that these people, they lack willpower and they continue to eat animal products, at least every now and then. But they accept that what they're doing is not really that right. They see that there is a problem with what they're doing. And when they are speaking with other people, they think, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this. So this is the first scenario. The second scenario, you convince these 10 people to avoid eating animal products or use animal products in general, because, I don't know, for whatever consideration, because that's sustainable or because that's, I don't know, better for the health or whatever reason. But they're not, you know, that among those reasons, we never mention animals. So they don't really care about animals. So in the short term, when it comes to the effects, the immediate effects, the second option may have a more direct effect if that reduces more the demand for animal products, and that means that less animals are killed. Well, that may happen. But in the long term, it seems to me clear that having an impact in the first way is going to be more significant. So that has direct impact in how we approach animal advocacy or animal activism in general. Now, what about wild animals? What about wild animals? What about our efforts in the long term to help wild animals? Well, it says that if we consider this, then things such as empowering us to make a difference in the future may be more important than having an impact right now. So that's why, for instance, when you consider the development of this new field in academia, where we study the well-being of animals in the wild and how to, help them. What's more important there really is not right now at this point trying to find the way in which we can help them more, but instead trying to find the ways that will optimize the development of that research in the future. So that's why we may be more willing to support, for instance, gaining more knowledge in academia about things like helping urban animals, because this is something that most people would agree with. And we can monitor this, we can do some pilot programs and so on that we can then apply elsewhere. But instead, if you propose now doing research in a certain form of helping animals that is going to be very controversial for environmentalists, then maybe that's not, from a strategic viewpoint, the best thing, because it's not really going to be the one that's going to have the best impact in the long term. So I think this is an important consideration here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, but I just think there's a lot of parallel arguments that could happen as well. Like, it could create discussion, it could get more people to understand the value of wild animals. So yeah, I understand all the arguments, but I feel like there's also parallel arguments kind of happening. But I agree that, like, the utility, if it can be shown, that comes with working with these groups, that will probably outweigh the current philosophical objection I would have, I think, because there are compromises that need to be made in these situations. But yeah, I still think there'll probably come a time when, I don't know, we'd sort of have to confront the massive incompatible, like what I see as incompatible values to achieve a wider goal. But at the same time, I sort of agree that we can't be too picky right now in terms of like resources and achieving even, I guess, short-term goals to get to those long-term goals.
I agree that in the long term, there's going to be a point, even if we look for collaboration, there's going to be a point, just as there are many topics right now where we disagree, where we may have a strong disagreement there. And I think that for that, it's important to, among animal advocates, to spread this concern for all sentient beings, and to inform animal activists, really, and people sympathetic to animal activism, to inform them about the very fact that an ethic of concern for sentient beings is different from an environmentalist approach. So I'm not speaking, I'm using the term inform. I'm not using other terms, because it's not that we need to convince them that we should care for sentient beings rather than other entities like ecosystems or species. Is that we need to inform them about this, because many animal activists aren't even aware of this. They aren't aware of the difference between animal ethics and environmental ethics. And I think that from a long-term perspective, especially, we need to increase a lot the extent to which animal activists are, aware of all these things and have a strong philosophical training. Maybe I don't know if training is the right word here, but are really aware of the philosophical underpinnings of what they are doing. I mean, this really is fundamental. And it's something that, for instance, at Animal Ethics, the organization I work with, we are trying to do. I mean, it's one of our main goals, but it's really challenging, because it's true that many animal activists aren't really not just aware of all these things, but they're not aware of the importance of having this strong philosophical background to their work.
Yeah. Like not speaking from a strategic point of view or anything, but just personally, I would agree with the environmental value or point that we need clean air to breathe. But that's about as far as it goes for me. Like, I don't know if I'm just a radical anti-nature person, but I just don't see much utility in the natural world or nature. Like, and then people say, oh, don't you want clean air? Don't you want clean oceans? I'm like, yeah, as long as it brings me and consciousness and conscious well-being, but it doesn't seem to be doing that in a big way. So I think I said this to you before. If someone said choose between two worlds, like the world we have now or a world without nature at all, but well-being is like 90% higher, or just a significant percent higher, I would choose that one. So yeah. I don't know. I don't know how much like someone like me could be aligned with. But when I say someone like me, I find my view quite logical. Yeah, I mean, I think this would require like a separate discussion video, because there's so many problems with the environmentalist concerns. From a practical standpoint, as we just discussed, I can see the utility. So the utility is the big like convincer for me in terms of not being too critical or taking a different strategy. But we're having kind of an open-ended, honest philosophical discussion. Like I don't place that much value on, if any, on something like nature, only insofar as it could provide, it's nature that's instrumental, but it's being treated as intrinsically valuable, and the non-human animals within it is being treated as instrumental. It's backwards. So yeah. Before we finish up, I really just wanted to ask you about two topical debates that are happening at the moment, one more than the other. And we briefly talked about it before. I don't think you think they're important, but they're just kind of these heated kind of discussions people have. The first was this argument to remove predators altogether from a lot of different animal population areas. And the argument put forward here is that in any other world or in any other, if an alien species was introduced that needed to live off the flesh of another animal for the rest of its life, you would be justified. The rights violation of murdering the alien predator would be justified in order to save all these herbivorous animals, like herbivores. So do you think it would be ethical to remove predators? And I can understand the validity in that argument. It's not the policy I would enact. I would try and enact another policy like feeding the alien predator with fake meat or something like that. There's all these other ways around it, but I understand the validity. And also recently, I don't know, I came up with it, I may have read it somewhere, but this argument for domesticating wild animals, I actually think has a lot of potential. I think it could be potentially a good idea. Not mass breeding them, obviously, for slaughter, but just improving their life so much so because when you think about it, we have become increasingly domesticated, and I think that's been more in that good than in that bad. So I updated my Facebook status once to we should domesticate wild animals, and I gave some reasons for it. And the amount of hate it got was just insane, like from other vegans. They wouldn't even entertain the idea, which I think was pretty telling in itself. But I just think that between like keeping things exactly as they are in nature and like killing animals like predators, I feel like the domestication is a good middle ground, but it's seen as extreme because of the appeal to nature fallacy. But yeah, do you have any strong views on any of that?
Yeah, okay. So one thing there is that terms can be normatively loaded in very heavy ways. So the word domestication, if you are an animal activist, it has very, very bad connotations. Why? Because domestication basically has equaled exploitation. And actually, this is one reason also why people, especially animal advocates, maybe, may have a tendency to have this idyllic view of nature. Because, when they consider animal exploitation, they see that as something terrible. And they can imagine, okay, what's the alternative scenario for animals that is not animal exploitation? And they may think, well, animals living free out there in the wild. So that's why they think that's good. Well, that's not good. So the best situation would be a different one, not the first one, nor the second one. And now, this being said, it's probably better from a tactical viewpoint then, I think, to avoid certain terms that can have those connotations, because people may misunderstand then what you are saying. So maybe instead of saying domesticated, you can use a different term. So, for instance, sometimes what we want is to rescue animals and provide them with care. Like, for instance, suppose that you rescue an animal that has been exploited. Where do you put that animal? Do you release the animal in the wild? But the animal in the wild is not going to survive. So maybe an animal sanctuary is something good. And animal sanctuaries, they have all sort of positive connotations. But then what if the animal you saved is not an animal that was exploited? You just rescued an orphan wild animal. And the orphan wild animal is not going to survive. It's not that you can release the animal in the wild, it's going to make it. That's not going to happen. So maybe you can take care of the orphan animal in a sanctuary. And the same thing can happen with other animals that you can help in the wild that may be sick or injured or whatever. So maybe the idea of using animal sanctuaries instead of, thinking of in terms of domestication can be useful, even if the idea you want to convey really is the same one. Anyway, that's just a possible idea there. Then something else concerning predators, it's very easy to make a mistake, which is the following one. So suppose, I don't know, just consider this thought experiment. And this is a thought experiment I put in a paper that I wrote like, I don't know, a long time ago. So suppose that I am, going somewhere and I happen to see a fox, and the fox is gonna kill a rabbit. And it also happened that I have this vegan meal, and I can give the vegan meal to the fox, and then the fox won't eat the rabbit. So should I do it? And if you care about sentient beings, the answer is yes, I should do it. I mean, if you let the fox eat the rabbit, then something very bad is going to happen. I mean, in fact, even if you gave the fox the food and you killed yourself the rabbit, you would be doing something wrong, very wrong. But on the overall, the harm suffered by the rabbit would, depending on how you kill the rabbit, could even be lower than if you don't do anything. And this is something very counterintuitive at first. When you think about this, you think, what the hell is going on here? I mean, this is crazy. But then when you think about this in detail, you can see that this is so. So this gives you a reason then to think, well, suppose that I go and every day there is a fox. There are different foxes. I mean, not the same fox. Every day I can find a predator that I can give some food to the predator and avoid that the predator is killing a prey. And, it seems that this would be a good thing. But then when you consider the big picture, you may then think, well, maybe this drives us to the idea that we should exterminate predators. Now, this is something that is terribly counterintuitive to many people. So it doesn't seem like, from a strategic viewpoint, a good thing to preach. But then, really, we can also think something else. Is this something feasible today? Is this something that policymakers are going to accept doing? And the answer is clearly not. But then there are other things we can do that are totally acceptable, that people will like and policymakers will like, and that can actually end up meaning that there is less wild animal suffering around, including wild animal suffering caused due to predation. So for instance, suppose that there is a certain area that is going to be reforested. And we can reforest it by planting certain trees there or different trees. I don't know, maybe oaks or I don't know, whatever, another kind of trees. I don't know, whatever. And some bushes, for instance. And you can decide, well, you see, we've seen that if we plant the bushes, the animals that are going to be living there, the ecosystem as such will be different than if we plant the oaks. And suppose that we learn that the ecosystem that may be there if we plant the bushes is going to be one in which there are going to be animals who have longer lifespan, who don't reproduce so much, whose lives are typically better. And suppose that in that ecosystem there are shorter traffic chains and so on, all this in comparison to the other ecosystem. And suppose that this results in the fact that we can expect that if we plant the oaks, there's going to be much more wild animal suffering there than if we plant the bushes. Now, I'm not telling this is so. I mean, this is just an example. It can be the other way around. But this shows that this would give us a reason, that may be a very strong reason, to plant the bushes in this case rather than the oaks, right? And it would be the case that if we plant the bushes, there will be less predation. The fact that there will be less predation, or the expectation that there will be less predation, is not in itself what should lead us to prefer that. It's the fact that the lives of animals in general will be better there. And it may be that there are other factors in addition to predation to choose one ecosystem over the other from the point of view of the animals. But this shows us a way in which we could have a much more significant impact than by, in practice actually, than by thinking in terms of, well, yeah, killing the predators or not killing the predators. Then in addition, there is a further consideration, which is that most people, when you present them with a certain measure that could be way better for humans than the current situation, but if reaching there would require killing a number of humans, maybe a large number of humans, most people would accept it. Given this, if we are furthering a non-speciesist approach or an anti-speciesist approach, actually, it says that it's not a good idea, really, to promote doing something that people would never accept in the case of human beings. That's why I don't favor killing predators. Of course, it may be that it's good for predators, for instance, to implement measures like, for instance, I don't know, contraception programs. And there are some people around there who think, oh, this is horrible. You are somehow intervening there in ways that prevents them from reproducing, which is something they want to do. Well, to start with, we could say about this. Reproduction is not such a great thing, as we've seen before. It's a source of much, of many harms for animals, of much animal suffering. But then, setting this aside, it's something that most people, most animal activists accept in the case of, for instance, I don't know, feral dogs, for instance, or feral cats. And it's something that can be very good for the animals themselves. Like, for instance, if you have a population of pigeons in a certain town, it's better for the pigeons to have to be living in a smaller population than in a larger population, because in a smaller population, it will be easier for them to get food, to get places where they can take shelter, etc. And often the alternative to contraception is people killing the animals. So I don't know, even if contraception, you think, well, this is not that good for animals, it's obviously better than being killed. I mean, no one can convince me that it would be better for me or for any animal to be killed rather than to be not allowed to reproduce. That seems a crazy view.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to reproduce, so I don't care. I wouldn't care if someone gave me that option.
So considering all this, if it came to reducing the population of predators or some predators, using contraception would always be preferable to killing them. So I guess this is what I would mention about this.
Yeah, I think I agree with the overall idea that that kind of policy would contribute to an idea of speciesism. On an individualistic level, though, if I were to hold my values constant, if I saw a child abuser about to kill a child, I would, and the only option, so it's a very narrow kind of argument, I think, in some ways, the only option was to kill, like I couldn't stop him in any other way, like the way you can't really stop wild animals because there's no prisons or anything like that for them. The only way was to harm him or kill him. I would, or her, whatever. So if I were to hold that view constant with non-human animals, in a way I'd have to concede to the argument. But I think it only works in that kind of, you have no other choice and there's no other option and you want to save anyone would probably save like a bunny being eaten alive if the option was to kill the predator in a less painful way. But I don't know how unlikely it actually is as a solution to, because there's already things like big game hunting, you know, that kill predators. So I've seen people that support this argument say, oh, actually it is a practical solution because we already do it. And arguably we could do it in a way that saves more herbivores. So I don't know, really.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, again, here we have to combine and we have to examine separately the more philosophical and the more practical aspects of the issue. So on a philosophical level, you may be a consequentialist or a non-consequentialist. So consequentialists would agree that if killing someone innocent is gonna be what prevents that innocent being from causing more harm by killing others, then you should do it. Then if you are a non-consequentialist, there are a number of non-consequentialist views that will agree with this. So even if they are non-consequentialists on other aspects, they will say, yeah, but it's nevertheless better to kill someone who is an innocent rather let that innocent being innocently maybe kill many others. There are some non-consequentialist views that reject this. And these are views that some people hold in the case of human beings, in some cases, though there is always a threshold for that, because people would always be in favor of killing an innocent human being, if that were the only way to prevent that human being to innocently kill, I don't know, 1 million people, right? So it's just a matter of numbers at the end of the day. I mean, there are some people who may reject this, who may say, well, even if they are killing 1 billion people, even if they're killing everyone, we shouldn't let that happen. We should let that happen if that requires killing an innocent being. Well,
I think that's insane. I kind of think that's really crazy.
Yeah, I mean,
I think I mentioned to you before, I'm a threshold deontologist, so individual rights are my priority until it can be shown that very good consequences would come about in lieu of the rights violation. So I have a high threshold, but there is a threshold. Then I'm like, okay, you can kill this one person if it's going to save 1 billion. Because I find like hard deontologists really crazy, like the one you just described. You know, I would let one person die to save 1 million, or one animal die to save 1 million animals. It's not a nice thing to say, but
yeah.
Come on.
Well, I don't know if it's a nice or a non-nice thing to say. That depends on your normative views. What I would disagree with, though, is with people who hold one view when it comes to humans and another view when it comes to non-human animals. I mean, that's wrong. So thinking that only humans should be defended by deontological constraints, that really is unacceptable. That's an speciesist viewpoint. And people defending this view will come up with all sort of arguments saying, no, but humans, these have these specific capacities. They all have some inherent worth. Or they may say, well, you know, they have this self-awareness, or, well, I think none of those arguments works really.
Yeah.
So what I disagree is with the view that you can apply those constraints for humans and not for non-human animals. Now, this being said, if you apply these constraints for humans, you should apply them for non-humans, although there's gonna be some threshold. So maybe you wouldn't be killing a predator because the threshold is not reached, and that's fair enough. While a non-consequentialist may be ready to kill the predator if that means that you are saving a huge number of animals. Now, on a practical level, recall what I mentioned before about spreading speciesist views, because many people hold this constraint when it comes to humans. I think that in order to challenge speciesism, we shouldn't be accepting this when it comes to non-human animals. So that's why I don't think that backing this view that it's acceptable to kill a predator for the sake of killing other animals is good for animal activists, because it will convey the idea that speciesism is right, because people will understand that we wouldn't be saying the same thing if instead of a predator we were considering a human being. So that's why I don't think it's a good idea, even if in practice doing so would reduce a lot of suffering.
Yeah,
but again,
I mean, to be fair to that view though, they hold it constant. Like from what I've seen people debate, they say if a human had, it's like whole trait equalization, right? If they had all the same traits as a tiger or has a predator, like they needed to survive off human flesh or animal flesh forever, and there was no way of changing them and no prisons, which is the exact situation, they would kill the human. To be fair to that view, even though you disagree with it, in that sense, it's not speciesist, but I think on a broader level, it's going to massively come off as speciesist, because not everyone's into these philosophical debates, and it's going to understand the nuance and the differences.
Exactly.
So yeah,
that's a problem. Yeah. Actually, not just with the general public, but with animal activists themselves. They have a very hard time finding nuances here and there, and everything is extremely nuanced. So there are always all sort of considerations, and that people are not sensitive to. And actually, among animal activists, one problem to make progress with discussions such as this is that people will have certain dogmas and very like compartmentalized way of seeing things, and not being able to make connections, and not being able to discover the detail in every point, due to which reasonable views like and nuanced arguments like the one you presented, it's going to be very difficult for you to get it through an audience that is not really sensitive people.
Of course. I think we've been talking for like nearly 3 hours. It's been absolutely fantastic. I don't want to take up too much more of your time because you've